Hey folks, my name's Kevin and it's time for a little bit more knife nerdery today. Ooh, look at that. Ooh. Today we have the full small details review of the prototype of the Renegade Provisions Company God of Mischief, or G.O.M. This is a knife that I have been very excited to check out, and spoiler alert, I love it. I am very glad that I got in on the pre-order, and the pre-order is still open, so if you haven't gotten in on it yet, maybe this review will change your mind. I don't know. I think this knife is awesome. It's also filling a specific kind of spot in my life that I don't currently have much of. I'm much more of the type of person that has ultra milled out, super lightweight, very thin, little, small EDC knives. And that's not what this is. This is an EDC knife. Renegade Provisions Co. is making EDC items, but this is meant to be a thicker, sturdier, don't worry at all about breaking it utility cutter that you can do real work with. And I just don't have a lot in that space, and I think this does such a good job of filling that niche. Okay, let's back up for a moment. What is Renegade Provisions Co? Well, it's a guy named Chris in Ohio. You might know him for his Hanks. He went by Renegadeed EDC on Instagram for a while. That was his general EDC stuff. And as he built out Renegade, the things he wanted to sell in his shop, he created Renegade Provisions Co to be the kind of like moniker under which all of that is. Chris is like a productivity robot. He's one of those people that's kind of also like a success robot. He gets up at 6 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes he gets up at 4 o'clock in the morning because those extra hours of the day, instead of being like miserable and wishing he was asleep, he's productive. He works basically 3 full-time jobs. And he's one of those people that's just kind of, he's a bit of an empire builder, you could say. He's got a really big plans for what the future will look like. And I wholeheartedly believe that he will pull it off because he's a combination that's rare these days of extremely talented at things and extremely hardworking. And it's hard to find that. But when you put those two things together, you can kind of make magic happen. And he's also very, very picky and has very, very high standards. And so the result is that the products that he makes are fantastic. Like if you like Hanks, these are the best Hanks on the market. They just have to be because everything about them is so perfect. They're so, yeah, anyway, this is not a review of Hanks. One of the things that he makes is knives. So he has an earlier knife that was called the Gungnir, or just Gungnir, no the. You've probably heard of that knife because it made some waves for being kind of ridiculous in a great way, but kind of ridiculous. It is enormous. It is at least 4-inch, maybe even a little over 4-inch blade that's really tall, and it just is huge, huge, massive knife. And as a result, I didn't get it because it's enormous and I have medium-sized gloved hands. Medium glove-sized hands? I don't know what order to put those words in. And so it was just too big of a knife for me. But he's actually has small versions of that coming out too. I'm eventually going to get to check out a prototype, one of the smaller versions of that, and I'm definitely going to get on that because that overall blade shape is really appealing to me. But while he was talking and designing all those, I started, learning about this, and he started showing pictures of this, and this is finally a knife in my wheelhouse of blade lengths. This is a 3 1/4 inch blade, which is right in my sweet spot, but it's actually a full size handle on a 3 1/4 inch blade. We'll talk about that more when we get back there, but this is one of those things that this is a knife that it's finally a me size knife. It's also a very me style aesthetic. I think this is so freaking cool looking. Gungnir was also a very me style aesthetic, but this is very different. It has a lot of angularity here. But when we talk about the overall style of everything later, I think this is a knife that balances angularity and curves in a way that's really, really rare and really, really hard to do. And so overall, I think this knife just looks really freaking cool. Okay, so let's start talking about this blade. This is I don't know what you want to call this, a Wharncliffe, a very angular Wharncliffe. It also has like a harpoon shape on it. Maybe someone would call this a reverse tanto because of that bit, but I doubt it. This is probably going to be called like a harpoon Wharncliffe of some kind. Great, whatever, it doesn't matter. The point is that this is a utility cutting blade. So the low down flat edge and the strong tip here means that, especially with this harpoon shape, that allows you to either rest your thumb into it like this, or rest your forefinger like this in a pinch grip. It's all about using this tip to do utility cutting or getting a lot of force behind your cut. One of the benefits of the straight edge on a Wharncliffe is that you get a lot of leverage into your cuts if you're pushing down doing a push cut. This is meant to be a robust, sturdy utility user, and everything about it lines up with that. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. This wouldn't be an elephant in the room in any other knife, but because the Gungnir had such an aggressive, tall, thin, slicey hollow grind, I've heard a lot of people say they were surprised to see that this didn't. I've also heard some people say that they're not going to buy it because of that. And I think, that's fair. You do you. I think you're kind of missing the point though, because this knife is not meant to be a ultra feather precision behind the edge, whittly slicing knife. This is meant to be a sturdy, utility, robust knife, and this grind is perfect for that. I think one of the reasons people also expect this to be a hollow grind is because it kind of is reminiscent of the Brian Brown Jaeger. That's also a very angular, geometric knife that is in that kind of sheep's foot reverse tanto, and that one has a deep hollow. So you can combine those two things, but the problem when you do that, there's a time and a place for it, but the tip on something like that is going to be so thin that it becomes fragile almost. And the tip on this is perfect. If we look at the way that these swedges go, so we've got this big swedge right here, and then we've got this additional swedge right there, and they come down to something that is, I'm going to close this to make it the angle, something that is precise but not dainty. This is thin enough and precise enough that I was able to do some really nice precision cutting. I've actually done a pretty good amount of cutting with this, and I tried to do some really careful tracing the shapes out with this, and it works perfectly. But this tip is not the kind of thing that you could push on the side of this and it's not going to bend. And that is just not true when you have that super, super faint, thin, fragile tip that you get from a hollow grind. And so this, I think, perfectly matches that. Overall, our blade stock is on the thicker end of what I'm used to, but again, perfectly balanced with the overall size of this knife. It feels balanced. This is a 0.151, 151 thousandths blade stock, and this grind is it's only, I think, 0.8 inches. I forget what I measured this at, but it comes down, it's aggressive now, that it's coming down to 23 thousandths pound on the edge. And again, you might be thinking, 23 thousandths, don't people make it at 15 thousandths? Again, a different purpose. This is meant to be thin enough that this is a good slicer. And trust me, it is. I tore through a ton of cardboard in it. Part of the reason is because it feels so good to put your thumb up here that you have a lot of leverage when you're pushing through stuff. So you have all the force you need. This can destroy cardboard, but it's trying to be still robust enough behind the edge that this isn't dainty. So we also have, like I said, we've got this harpoon shape up here, and this is where things get interesting from how the ergonomics of your hand as you push into these cuts, because this is the perfect kind of place for you to rest your finger in these types of utility push cuts, and also for your thumb. And like I said, when you're pushing through cardboard, it just locks your thumb in a really, really nice way right here. The one thing that I will say is that past this doesn't feel good to put my finger on. The aggressiveness of this angle right here as the swedge comes in. Let's see if I can get you looking right down at it. That means that this is, let's get the light. This is it comes in sharp enough that this is a reasonably thin spot. Now it's not thin, there are thinner ones, but this is a problem that I find a lot on utility blade cutting knives that have a swedge at the top. It just doesn't feel anywhere near as good to press against this thin spot. You can, it's just not that it feels bad, but it doesn't feel anywhere near as good. And this feels so dramatically good that in comparison, this feels bad. On a different knife, this might not feel bad. But what I would personally do if I was designing this knife is I would take the angles of this and just make them less shallow. What word do I want? I would make them more steep. Yeah, that's what I want. And so the appearance, you'd still have the same general look on the side of having this angle here, this extra geometric shape, but it would widen this out. I would probably make this 50% wider, maybe even twice as wide. I would stretch that out, and that would just make it more comfortable if you're going to choke up like this. Because as good as this is for me, I also often want to work up right along the tip. And this is a knife that you can do this. And again, it feels fine. But if I'm going to be putting any kind of real pressure on it, I would rather that be a wider surface. But again, this is actually a really great length for me to be able to kind of do really precision, precise stuff, getting in, cutting threads, you're cutting into packaging. It's great. We also have this opening hole. We're gonna talk about this more in the action, but we've got this really nice chamfer along the entire inside. And this isn't, it's not sharp, but the other thing is that the size of this opening hole means that it's not really in a position that you can use your finger very much. I pretty consistently always use the meat of my finger, and so I don't really worry about whether or not this would scrape me. But this is actually one of the things that is going to be changing. And we'll talk about this again more in the action, but one of the things that's going to happen is there's going to be jimping inside this hole. That's something that almost no one does, but it's a really interesting and cool kind of jimping. And one of the times where jimping is being applied in a way that actually makes sense, a lot of people put jimping on the lock bar, and it doesn't make any sense because the jimping causes traction if you're moving across the jimping, but if you're moving along those lines, then it doesn't do anything. It just gives you roughness. And what he's doing to this is something that I believe the production versions of the Gungnir have as well. It's this kind of stepped jimping where it's like gives you these little tiny micro step ridges, and he's calling it ziggurat jimping. If you've never heard of that, ziggurat is the name for like basically a kind of tiered stepped pyramid that from ancient Mesopotamia. And so it's like this, like it's a pyramid, but it's made up of like steps. And so what that's going to do is give you really, really great traction on this. And so, but it's also going to give you little kind of corners. So I think once that's done, you definitely aren't going to be using your finger to run like that. What you're going to do is use this to push in. Now, we'll again talk more about this in the action, but when I sometimes find myself slide off of this because of the strength of this detent at the moment. And so I think that jimping is going to really, really help there. Speaking of jimping, we have the jimping on this knife is actually pretty interesting. And down here, I kind of love it and think it's kind of brilliant. Up here, I think it kind of doesn't work. I will also explain why I don't think it really matters. But down here, what we've got going on is this almost aggressively shallow jimping. It's very shallow, but the bigger thing is that it's the actual cuts in are very small, and they're very small in ratio to the size of the crest, the top. And so the result of this is that even though there's really crisp, sharp corners, on my hands at least, this does not grip my thumb at all if I don't apply pressure. And so the result is just kind of feels textured. I don't love jimping, and so I kind of love the way this works. If I apply more pressure, it still is not catching me, but it's textured. But it's not until the very end when I push firmly, now it locks me right in. And so to me, this is kind of magical because again, I don't want jimping unless I need it. And so the fact that this feels just kind of a little bit textured and is comfortable and kind of I can slide my finger around under normal use means that it's only acting as jimping in times when I'm really pushing into it. And both with my thumb or with my finger in a pinch grip, this really does lock you in perfectly well once you have it. But because, or at least on my fingers, it doesn't really while I'm not pushing on it. The last thing I'm going to talk about with the blade is the plunge grind. This is one of the things that I wish would be different, but so does Chris. The plunge grind is the grind that's taking from the full thickness of the blade stock down to the thinness behind the edge. And you can see that on this one, it comes right up to the edge. And this is something that I complain about on knives, because what it means is that you don't have any room to sharpen. As you go up this, you are going to be immediately hitting this grind, and you're going to get that kind of smile at the back of the knife. And the thing is Chris knows all about this. This wasn't a unintended, I mean, this wasn't like a forgotten thing. Reate says that they simply can't do it. I don't know why. I don't understand what the explanation for that is, but something about the overall geometry of how this all works, Reate says that it's a limitation of their manufacturing abilities that they can't pull this up. He asked them to make it angled more upward, and they said they can't. Okay, but that is something I wish that could be different. Now, what that does leave you, though, is a very large amount of thickness right here. And so this is the full thickness of the blade stock, this entire finger choil spot. And what that means is this finger choil feels fantastic. This is something that I love the Quiet Carry Drift. It's one of my absolute favorite knives, but it's also kind of my quintessential example of a finger choil that leaves you with a very thin amount of material that you're pushing against. On this knife, I find that I'm usually pressing backward and downward into this spot, and so it doesn't really matter. But if you do ever pinch up like this and apply your pressure upward, you're pushing against something that's quite thin, and that can be kind of uncomfortable. This, you have no problem with that whatsoever. You've got this entire full thick spot, and most of the finger choil, at least the entire back part that you're typically pressing against, also has this full thickness of the handle, and it's got these wonderful, nice rounding parts right there. This just feels so good to press against, and especially in the grip that I most normally have this in, if I'm choked up, this just feels, it's one of my favorite finger choils. It's great, and it's so minimal of a finger choil in the sense that it kind of is just where the handle leads you. It's one of those things where it's kind of a choil, it's kind of not. It's kind of just where you would put your hand. Okay, let's move back and talk about these handles. What we have here is something that like geometrically and like stylistically balances the front of the knife. We've got this flat bit here that continues along, and then we've got this angle here and this angle here that it can mirrors that angle there and that angle there. But what we also have is something that kind of metaphorically or like intent-wise mirrors what this blade is for. This is a utility working, like you can get real work done knife, and the handle is thick and heavy in a way that is actually really, really good for that kind of use case. It's perfectly rounded in all the right spots that make it feel great when you're actually kind of bearing down on the knife. Now, the handle itself, I said, is a full-size handle. This is 4.4375, and the result is that this feels really, really nice in my hand, but there's plenty of room if you have much bigger, and that's including the fact that you can then choke up. Now, for me, this leaves plenty of room at the back of the handle that I'm not using, but my God, everything just feels so locked in, and the curvature, the rounding, the radiusing along the edges here, everything feels just so nice. This handle itself is thicker than I typically have. I tend to have knives that are like this drift. They're very, very thin and light, and this is so much thicker. But it's done in a way that is actually really, really nice. This is 0.545 inches, but the entire thing is contoured here. And so that measure is the thickest spot. It thins back out at the edges. And then the result is that it just fills your hand in this really, really pleasant way. There's enough of a corner on the edges that you can definitely understand the orientation and for indexing purposes, but the general contour and slope here just fits really, really nicely. We also have something that I think is really, really rare, a balance of curvature and angularity. And the curvature is in the spots you want it, and angles in spots that you can get away with it. What I mean here is that all of these lines here, these are very soft swooping lines. And so none of these spots here are sharp. These are like, if this doesn't perfectly line up with your hand, pressing here versus here versus here, it's not going to be the kind of thing where any part of this feels bad. This just kind of feels good as you run your finger down that. But at the back, now this is a spot where you can get away with having angles. These angles, like I said, mirror those angles, but what they also do is make that it curves, meaning that the handle curves into your palm. And so when you are in this pinch grip that this is clearly designed for with the harpoon spot there, this nestles really, really nicely at the back here. And it means that you can kind of push forward and put actual weight from your hand in and get a lot of force into that cut. So this is a bolster lock. So what that means is that we've got titanium at the front, but it's one continuous piece that runs along this entire part and makes up the entire handle. There's a cutout then that allows a scale to act as an overlay instead of an inlay. And this is, in this case, made of OD green micarta. I got the version that was in natural micarta and it was also available in black micarta. And then he had a version that was completely like blacked out as available too. I believe he also has other colorway combinations with that black that is that are not available during the pre-order, and there's some kind of like special thing he's doing later. I don't know. I don't know if he's talked about that publicly, so hopefully I didn't just spill that. But anyway, it doesn't matter. What you get here is this really cool look. He has this angle up here. We'll talk about what that does in a moment, but you get this general kind of, I love the way that bolsters look. The market is getting a little bit flooded with just how many pennies are putting out there and everything like that, but I think that the overall aesthetic of it looks really nice. A lot of bolsters are either just perfectly flat or even angled down, and this one's angled upward, and that's kind of uncommon. I think it looks nice, but it does have one really significant consequence, and that is that this right here is a sharp corner. This is the only thing about this knife that I truly think ought to be changed, and if it isn't changed in the production version, is something that I'm going to change myself. And the good news is that it's actually really easy to fix this. The fact that this angle comes up like this and slopes in right here means that this is a very acute angle. And while there's a very nice rounding on this edge, there's no kind of chamfer here or chamfer there to make this not be sharp. And so this was actually really interesting, because when I was talking with Chris about this, he said he never once feel this. Like when he hold this, it never jabbed him. This jabs me every single time I hold this. So this corner right there, if I'm holding it in this grip right there, it's poking me. If I'm holding it in this grip right there, it's poking me. And if I'm holding it like in that grip, again, it's a different finger, but it's poking me. In every single one of these, I immediately felt it, and he never felt it. So what's going on? What's different? Well, for one, I have smaller hands than him. And for two, I don't do anywhere near as much manual labor as him. I'm a keyboard person. I fully acknowledge that. And so my skin is both more flexible, but also it's a narrower finger. And as a result, my finger is much more easily pushing into this gap and thus hitting this corner. And his finger is much more likely spanning this gap and just never actually being down deep enough to press into that. So he said that he mentioned to Reate wanting to change this, and they said something about it making the stock too thin right there. I don't think it needs to be an aggressive corner removal. What I'm going to do, if this is still like this on the production version, is take this scale off. I'm going to mark where that spot is, and I'm going to take a file and just ever so slightly, you could use sandpaper, knock this corner back. Just file it down. A very small chamfer, similar to the kind of chamfer we have right here. And the good news is, this entire mod is going to take like maybe 45 seconds. It does not take a long time to do that to micarta. And so if this is something that's still like this on the production version, it's something that you can really easily change yourself. And it's something that I know that I'm going to change because it pokes me every single time. But this is the only thing that is sharp. Nothing else is sharp. Everything else feels really, really good. There's a chamfer right on this edge, and this isn't sharp at all. And a very common hotspot on knives like this is the clip. And this clip feels fantastic. I kind of regret not getting this version, because just like on the Gungnir, this was available in both a wire clip or a milled titanium clip. And I went with the wire clip because I love wire clips, but also because it allows you to get full deep carry. With the way that this angles back at the back, there's so little that is actually showing if you have a full deep carry, and I just couldn't pass that up. This version, because of the way it hits right there, is this much showing off. And that's not bad for a milled tie clip, and that's actually really pretty good. Especially it's benefited by the fact that this is sloped up. But you know, I couldn't do this if I could have full deep carry. But the thing is, I kind of regret it because this clip is fantastic. I love this clip. This is the kind of thing where it is there's a good amount of ramp in both directions. It's not just a sharp thing, so it's not going to like stick on you no matter how you're sliding this. And the size and positioning and everything like this makes it line up in a really nice way. It doesn't press into my hand in anywhere. It's hitting right behind this groove. And so, and if I choke up, it's hitting even further back. And so this, I just don't really even feel it. The other thing that they're doing is this really nice chamfer at the back, and all of these corners have been knocked down with micro chamfers. And so their end result is that this just feels fantastic. And since I like the way it looks and I like the way it functions, I kind of really love this clip. And I'm debating if I would have accepted that just to be able to have this clip. I think at the end of the day, I'm happy with my choice because he's also making it so that the wire clip will fit things like a Lynch clip. It's going to be a standard Spyderco spacing. And so I think if I want to spice it up or make it a little bit fancier, there's going to be plenty of options for me to be able to add a fancier clip back on. Now, the one thing that he did say he's going to change as far as that he considered a sharp corner is this back here. Because I'm encountering this side, I don't ever find any part of this back part hard, but if I do flip the knife over and run this along my hand, that is a jabby corner, and I just never find that I'm pressing on it. So I'm gonna say take it or leave it, but what he said he's gonna do is round this off some. What I don't know is if he means that that's literally going to become a rounded corner, like rounded, truly rounded, or if he's going to just like extend this to be a little bit shallower so that this is more obtuse and it just is less pointy. I honestly don't know. It might also mean that he's just adding in a stronger chamfer at the back corner right there. Either way, he said he's going to address that, and it's something that doesn't really bother me to begin with. Coming to the front, we've got these pivot collars, and I think that overall just adds a nice kind of balance to the knife. It makes this overall look a little bit less blank up here. This is the bead blast that Reate does, and it's fine. I don't love this kind of finish on knives. I'm getting kind of bored of it for one thing, but it also shows scratches. So this came to me this way. I haven't taken apart this knife, but it looks like someone slipped right there. I don't know, maybe Chris himself did it. And you can see that it takes snail's trails a little bit. It's extremely common finish on Reate knives, and so it's not like this is a more snail trail knife than others, but yeah, I don't love that. One of the things he did say he's going to change for the production version is he's going to make this pivot more flush with the overall bolsters. I think that's a good idea. I think it's the only thing that bubbles out like this, and so I think it would make more sense and feel better if it were more flush, but at the same time, I don't mind it as it is. I kind of like when the pivot is feelable because then it gives me an indexing point and also gives me a little something to kind of press against in various different grips, but again, I think it's probably a good idea. If we talk about how we open this knife, so this is one of the things that I've heard some people complain about. I don't have any trouble opening this, but what you get is a very similar arrangement as you have in Gungnir, which is a very small amount of bolster. And the thing is some people use like the top of their knife or top of their thumb and kind of pull on the bolster itself. And so to some people, I've heard numerous people complain about that knife, and it's going to be the same thing here, that this just gives them a small amount of space to get onto. I don't personally open the knife that way, so I don't have any trouble with that. I find this just fine, but I will also note that I don't push where the scalloping here implies that I should. There's a scallop on both sides, and that means that the space for your thumb is being opened up right here, and the implication is that you'd press like in the center of this. But because this is above and that's kind of coming down, I find that kind of an awkward and weird place to press. I always press up into this corner. And so if it were me designing this knife, I would expand this scallop right here up further so that you get a little bit more access towards the top. I think if they were to pull this down a little bit, that could maybe do the same thing, because maybe I'd start pushing down further. But at the end of the day, yeah, I don't have trouble opening this up, but I think some people potentially could. I think it could be a little bit better, but it's not bad. This is, because it's a bolster lock, this is the kind of thing where we have a full thickness right here, which means that we are able to have a steel lock bar insert, and it does have an over travel stop, but that's kind of redundant on bolster locks because the bolster itself, you can't push past that, so it's acting as a double bolster lock, but that just makes it even more sturdy. And you can see that we also have an internal an internal lock bar relief. So this is, even though it is as thin as you would find on some liner locks, it's thick enough right here that they still added this little bit of flexibility. We do have a full backspacer that goes in this entire way. Now that is lending to the overall weight. We'll talk about that in just a moment, but it also means that this entire thing is just a nice flush surface. Now they have micro chamfers along the entire inside of this, and so it's not flush in the sense that there's no seam right here. It actually, but it has, everything is like very tightly in, and it just feels really nice. They also are doing my favorite style lanyard hole. I don't like lanyards personally, so I'm not a lanyard person, so my favorite lanyard hole wouldn't exist at all. But if you're gonna have it, I'd love it to be the kind of thing that doesn't show up on the knife and instead is hidden and built into the backspacer right there. Now, talking about the weight on this knife, this is one of the things where, again, it's paired with the use case. So this is a 4.488 ounce knife, almost just shy of 4.5 ounces, and it's a 3 1/4 inch blade. And so that is pretty high on the ounce and inch mark for an EDC knife. But again, while this is intended to be an EDC knife and carries really well as one, this is the kind of thing where it's intended to be a heavier duty working knife. And in cases like that, the weight here actually feels really good. It has heft to it and it has like momentum. You kind of have a little bit of inertia as you're moving forward. And so this is the kind of thing where, for the types of like power cuts that I'm pushing through stuff that I would want to use this for, that weight is actually a really good thing. And it's also only 4.5 ounces. So while that is maybe higher than you might expect for the size, that's not a lot. The other really important thing is that the balance point is right here at the top of this bolster, and it is basically perfect because that is exactly where your index finger is when you're holding the knife. And what that means is that everything is kind of aligned. That means that the amount of weight you have in front and behind is all in balance, and the distribution of this, because of the fact that we have this backspacer that is distributing the entire way, like this is not just like a chunk of metal right at the back. it's distributed really well. It feels really, really nimble. You feel the weight, but it doesn't feel like any part of it is out of balance with other things. If you choke forward, then now the balance point is right on your second finger. But this is, again, the kind of thing where you are now so up and close with the blade that you know exactly where the tip is. It does feel a little bit back heavy, but you're not doing the same kinds of motions when you're doing this. You're kind of motions like that or something like that. And in general, I think that the balance on this just feels really, really good. The weight on this feels really good. It's not going to be the knife for your gym shorts, but it was never intended to be. Now, when we close this knife up, we have something that looks like this. And this is, again, I think it's just a really good lines, very good flow. We have these straight lines that come right here. And then we have these, they're not lined up with each other, but we have these kind of mirroring each other lines coming down here and then lines coming down here. And I think it just overall looks really good. At the top, we have these curves, and this is all rounded in a way that feels really nice if you're doing the style of pinch grip where you keep your fingers on the blade. Your hand kind of just nests around this, and these radius ends here means that this just feels great in this kind of choke up onto the blade grip. Okay, let's finally talk about action. This is one of the things where in some ways this thing absolutely shines, and in some ways I kind of would make it a little bit different myself. So I think this knife has a little bit too strong of a detent for the size of this and shape of this hole and the fact that it has a front flipper. For both of these, I would want the detent to be slightly smaller, but slightly weaker. But I don't know, I might change my mind once they get that ziggurat jimping in, because the ziggurat jimping means that you would have really, really good traction as you push out. Now down here, I very rarely will slip out. It's usually pretty darn easy if I'm trying to just push the meat of my finger in and pop it out. And it pops out so freaking well. But up here, where my lever arm distance is shorter, I sometimes will slide out. You can see right now I'm doing just fine. But now, let me see. Can I get it? No. See, I'm trying to make it see if or a form where I will slide out. I can sometimes accidentally fail that. And so I think the ziggurat jimping will help, but I also think I would just personally lighten this lock bar. That's the second thing, is that this is a front flipper, and front flippers you typically want a little bit of a lighter lock bar, and this is on the pretty firm side for a front flipper. But the geometry of this front flipper and the positioning of everything means that it actually works spectacularly well as a front flipper. This is the kind of front flipper that sticks up above the front, and because of the curve right here, you can do proper geometry. You can push in the direction that you need for follow through. You can do that. A lot of front flippers are designed in a different way that I don't like anywhere near as much. This is the Shamwiri, the Wii production version of the Gareth Bull Shamwari, and I know this is like a beloved and adored front flipper, but this is one of my least favorite styles of front flipper nubs. What we got here is a very small nub that is in flush with the front of the handle, and what that means is you can't push up. The handle is in your way. You have to push out, and what that means is that you don't have follow through, because the moment that you break this detent, now your outward motion that you initially needed is in the wrong direction because the nub is up there. So you have to do this kind of like up and over kind of weird twisting. You can't just pop. And so while it works, like I can get it to work, and of course it works, it's just not as good as something that sticks out higher. This, because you can push this direction, you get exactly first of all, you have a bigger lever arm to begin with, but then you have the motion where you have follow through, and you can apply pressure on this the entire way. And so that works fantastically. Now this does, even with the detent, I think this is stronger than I want it to be, but it's if anything, it just gives you a really nice, powerful one. I think it would still work really, really well, though, because of the shape of it, if the detent was lighter. And I think it would be easier, because one of the things that I can't do with this knife is this. Like, if I anchor the base, then I absolutely can. But the detent is strong enough that it's not easy with my size hands to hold this knife, grip it firmly enough in a way that's going to make this not move around like this. And so if I anchor the base, I can easily do it. If I don't anchor the base, I kind of I got it there, okay. But it's like 8 times out of 10, I can't. I just kind of find myself going like, and I stop. But if the detent wasn't there, like the geometry of this works perfectly great. So I think a lighter detent This might be a preference thing, but I'm going to personally tune mine to be lighter if it comes. But now let's get into this jimping aspect, because this is really kind of a mystery to me. I talked about the jimping down here being this thing where for me and my hands, if I don't apply pressure, I don't catch it at all. And if I apply medium pressure or moderate pressure or even pretty firm pressure, I don't catch it at all. It's not until I push hard that it catches me really, really well. Well, it's the exact same jimping at the top. And so the result of this is that for me, this just is kind of non-functional jimping up here, because the moment that I'm pushing hard enough to actually catch that, I break the detent. But the moment I break the detent, I can no longer push hard enough to catch it. I can push, I can still do follow through, I can and apply pressure this entire way, but in a way that's not enough pressure for me to grip. And so for me, this jimping just doesn't work at all. I can run my finger over it with a plenty of force, and that's part of the reason why I'm having trouble, because to do this top version, because I have to like hook this in a way, because I can't pull with this traction. This is a mystery to me, because this is not how it works in Chris's hand. Chris sent me a video even after I explained this to him, showing me that it catches on his fingers. So at least on the version he has, his catch it. And some people have said to me already that yes, traction, like jimping like this will sometimes fill up with some like finger residue gunk in here. I went through this with alcohol and a Q-tip, and I completely cleaned this out. I guarantee that I got it completely cleaned out, and I still have no traction. But Chris does. And I honestly would have expected it to be the opposite. I would have expected my hands, which are less leathery than his, to grip more, because it'd be more easy for it to push into those little grooves. But it's not. It's unintuitive to me that this doesn't work for me and does work for him, but he has a video of this catching his finger perfectly, and for me, it's like nothing. So for comparison, this is the Dawn prototype. And if we look, the spacing on this jimping is like the tops, like the crests of these are nearly the exact same distance. But what's different is the space, like the width of the actual grooves. And this is about twice as wide. Everything else in terms of depth and everything is very, very similar. But this jimping catches my finger immediately, like there's catching. Very, very light pressure is catching. And so this, like that, I can't possibly slide off it. And one of the side effects of this is a very similar geometry. Like this one cuts back this way, but in terms of where the flipper tab extends to from where the pivot is and how high it comes up, they're almost identical on that front. Now, so as a result, when I pop this one out, as I'm coming back and applying this pressure, like this light amount of pressure here, I'm still gripping this. Like I'm still able to get traction. And so this, I get follow through the entire way. And so I get really, really great flipping action on this, even with a lighter detent. And this, I don't know. This is the kind of thing though, where like, I genuinely think you could drop the jimping off this entirely, and you would still get a really, really great flip because of the fact that it has this geometry on your side. I do love the fact that he extended the jimping up and over. That's one of the few complaints about this knife, is that he just ended it right there. And so with this, you can't, like this is completely smooth. You have to reach over, but it works. With this, if this jimping was effective for me, I would be able to pull, but it just doesn't. It just doesn't work for me. But I love the fact that he attempted to do that and pulled it up around. I don't know if this jimping is going to change in the production version. I've talked with him all about this, but I don't know if it. I don't know if it can change. It might be too late. I also don't know if he. It's not that he doesn't believe me. I mean, I show him it not working, but it works for him. And so it might be one of those things where, because of the fact that you still get such a good flick, it might be the kind of thing where he doesn't bother changing it because he doesn't really need to. Okay, talking about the overall opening though, you get this really nice thwack. No matter which way you're doing this, the shape and positioning of this blade means that the force is all up here. This cutout reduces the weight back here. And so the force is far out enough that you get the really great kind of like thunk into place feel. It's not as thunk into place as some, but boy, is it really, really still a very pleasant one. And then look at the way that this closes. Oh my God. So if you were to lighten the lock bar pressure to reduce the detent strength, this would fall even more and might even just full on free fall. But as is, this is one of my favorite kinds of falls, because it's the kind of action where it stays exactly where you put it. But even just like the slightest amount of jiggling, I'm not shaking. I'm just kind of jostling it in place. It's practically closing from the weight of its own blade. Look at that. And if you actually try to close this at all, it's like instant. You can feel just how incredibly low effort it is. It feels like it's trying to go home. And part of what that is, like I said, we have a thick enough blade, enough weight in the blade. And part of that is that Reate does this. They make these really tanky, really well-aligned, very straight blades. And the result is that even though you've got plenty of lock bar pressure here, everything is so well lined up. Nothing is torqued that everything is just like effortless. It's just so... it's such a good close. Love it. I love that. The action on this is the kind of thing where I find this just very fun to play with. I know that Chris is kind of like he likes to kind of he wants his knife to actually be used and not just be fidget toys. Let's put it that way. It's not that he makes fun of people that use them as fidget toys. He likes to play with knives as well, but he wants his knife to actually be used and not just a fidget toy. But this is definitely the kind of knife that is just very fun to sit there and flick and play with. I love it. Man, doing this under camera is confusing and rough. Okay, yeah, the action is just fantastic. So let's talk about fit and finish now. This is one of the things that, again, this is a Reate made knife, and you get that last mile extra perfection thing going on. Everything is so crisp and clean. Everything is so nice. Let's use one of his hanks to wipe down this blade. And let's look at these grind lines. We've got just like gorgeous satin finish there. And then we've got a hand rub satin there that's going the opposite direction. And then each of these swedges at the top have their own grind lines that are going in the angle of them. And so what you get is this really cool visual look. And all of these things are so precise. Everything is so clean. It all just looks so good together. Everything looks perfect. All of the little corners are all perfect, but nothing is sharp. Everything just feels and looks great. Also, this knife has been used, at least by me, a decent amount, and it shows like no wear here. So it's really, really good. As far as one of the things that Reate does really nicely on a bolster lock is that these things are just perfectly mated. There's a textural difference here, but there is absolutely no seam. There's no like height difference whatsoever. And if you come up around the top, and let's zoom in for a moment, you can see that like in our corners here, this is just, there's no gap. Everything is perfectly matched. Everything just absolutely perfectly lines up. I haven't taken this knife apart, but I assume that it's going to behave the exact same way of every other tanky Reate knife I've taken apart. And they all have this thing where you just kind of take the screws out, the knife falls apart easily, and then you put it back together and everything lines up and stacks exactly how you want, and it's instantly immediately centered. Now, I did take this pivot out just some to see if I, like how much lock bar pressure pivot pressure affects the action. And this is the kind of thing where this is cranked down all the way, and it has that completely effortless close, because it's not about tuning, it's about everything just being perfectly aligned. And that's, again, the last mile Reate stuff. The overall like finishing of all of these corners, everything is just so, this is an expensive knife, and when you get it in hand, it kind of oozes quality in that way that you've come to expect from Reate at this point. And so I think this is one of those things where, like, if the like ergonomics, if the action, if the like utility of the knife wasn't already convincing you, then the kind of last mile fit and finish excellence here is going to convince you that this is worth every bit of your penny, every bit of your money, every penny. Yeah, some phrase like that. Okay, so what are my final thoughts on this knife? And the end result is I am really, really impressed with it. I think this is just an incredibly beautiful knife. I think it looks really freaking cool. It's a badass looking knife, but it's also the kind of thing where it just has a lot of well thought out, balanced details. The ergonomics on this thing are so good. The positioning of everything is so good. The way it fits into your hand is so good. And then the visual style of this is a very strong aesthetic. It's got pretty sharp angular things in a way that really kind of make it feel aggressive, but the handle and everything is not aggressive. A lot of times that you have knives with big geometric things, everything's geometric. Like I'm not going to name names, but there's clips with there's geometric knives that have like sharp angled clips and stuff like that. And as a result, the fact that this is able to balance curved parts where you need them with angular parts where you can get away with them for stylistic reasons, I think that's the mark of someone that is clearly like an artistic designer that has thought through what it's going to feel like, with the one exception of this corner, and that's because his hands are so different from mine that it genuinely hadn't occurred to him. But I made it brought his attention now. So other than this one little corner here, everything else about this knife just feels great. And it's doing that kind of like sturdy, like I don't have any sense that I would damage it. I don't feel like I could break this knife. I feel like I could toss this knife around and not do anything to it. And yet when I'm going to flip it open, it's going to be perfectly aligned, slide right open with nothing, lock up like a freaking bank vault. I didn't mention about that earlier, but these tanky Reate builds just are so freaking solid feeling. It feels like a fixed blade. And I know that this blade shape is so incredibly useful. At the end of the day, I love this knife, and I'm so glad I got one. I'm so glad that Chris made it, and I'm so glad that I got to check it out. So thank you, Chris, for sending this to me. I gave you my initial impressions early on, and the few things that I mentioned there that I would change are the things that I've still mentioned here, and they're not. This is the only one that I really will care about, and I can really easily fix that myself. I think this knife is awesome. I think people are going to be really excited for it. And I think when they get it in hand and they feel how good this action is, and they just see how cool this looks and feel how good it feels in their hand, and then when they actually try to use it, then how easy it is to put power behind stuff, man, I think people are going to love it. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time.